housing, and members opposite can't claim differently.
Honourable Phil Goff.
Chairman, you know, this government, this national government, is essentially in this bill showing the continuity of policy from the Ruth Richardson government of the 1990s. With one exception, sir, the Ruth Richardson government in the 1990s was more honest. It simply slashed housing by 13,000 total housing stock, creating the housing crisis that Labor governments always inherit. And, sir, it introduced market rent that people could not afford. This government is trying to do it in a slightly more cunning way in this bill, because what it's doing is that it's first of all undermining the stock of state housing in the capital investment, and Nick Smith knows that. He knows that he has reduced, not increased, the number of state houses. Mr Smith, haven't you reduced the number of state houses by 700? Those are the figures that I have. Mr Smith knows that he has reduced the capital input into state housing, unless he is calling the Salvation Army in its latest report liars. Is the Minister doing that, or is the Minister ready to confirm that the Salvation Army that actually genuinely is concerned about the supply of housing for our most vulnerable and lowest income people, they say that whereas the Labor government increased the capital by a net $486 million, he has produced a net withdrawal of funds of $142. You see, it's the same old national government. They don't give a damn about the most vulnerable and the most needy people in this community. Well, I want to say this, Mr Smith. I do care about the people in my electorate who can't afford housing of their own. People who need the stability of housing for their kids' sake. People who, before they got a state house, had their kids go to a dozen different schools in as many months. That's what undermines the future chances of our kids today. And what is Nick Smith doing in this bill? He's taking away the fundamental thing that Housing New Zealand was able to provide, and that's stability and security of tenure. 30 years ago, when I was Minister of Housing, Mr Smith, I introduced something called income-related rents, and it said that we subsidised people so that their housing was affordable up to the point where they started to earn more money and then they lost their subsidy. So you've got 61,000 tenants that are on income-related rent, and you've got 4,800 that are on market rents. The Minister has that, Mr Chairman. What that shows is overwhelmingly the majority of State House tenants are the people who have very low incomes and who could not afford decent and secure housing in the private sector. But amongst those 4,800, when I talk to the people in my Housing New Zealand areas, are people whose incomes have gone up temporarily, but it's late in their life, they'll never be able to afford their own home, and their income will at a certain point again go down. And what Mr Smith is going to do, Mr Chairman, is throw those people out at a late point in their life when they can't afford a home of their own and take away their ability to have decent, affordable and secure housing. The whole reason why we have state housing, so kids can grow up in housing that is warm and healthy. And Mr Smith was quite right to say, hey, we will have all of our state houses properly insulated. But Mr Smith also needs to acknowledge that the one sector of our community that has done almost nothing to make those houses warm and dry is the private sector rental area. If you talk to any doctor in this country, you talk to the doctors, the GPs in my local community that service my low-income areas, they'll say one of their biggest problems is that in the private sector there isn't warm and dry and affordable housing. And what Mr Smith is doing in continuing what national governments have always done in the past is rip the guts out of Housing New Zealand. But what he's pretending this time is that he will take it off Housing New Zealand, 20% of the houses, and he'll give them to the community housing sector. Now, I'm all in favour, Mr Chairman, of the community housing sector, but I know what Mr Smith's next step is, that when he's transferred the responsibility, he'll start withdrawing the resources that he gives to the community housing sector, Mr Chairman. That is the plan of the national government. And what worries me is that once again, our most needy, our most vulnerable citizens in this country will be left in a worse position. It always amazes me that we have money to subsidise Rio Tinto, $30 million to a multinational that's going to pull out of New Zealand anyway. We'll give the moguls, the film moguls at Warner Brothers, tens of millions of dollars and change the legislation for them. We'll give the ability of Sky City to increase its gaming machines and $400 million in subsidies there. But when it comes to meeting the basic needs of human beings to have decent housing, particularly for our kids, because it's the kids that benefit most, this government doesn't care. Doesn't matter how you dress it up, Mr Smith, that's what you're doing. You're taking the housing stock away from Housing New Zealand, where there was some guarantee that people would have ongoing access to that sort of housing, and you are removing the security of tenure, which is a basic need for our communities. We've got schools in my electorate like the May Road School or Hay Park School or Wesley Primary, where I talk to the principals, and they say, thank God in this area on the Isthmus of Auckland, we have state housing, otherwise low-income people couldn't afford to live on the Isthmus of Auckland. In my area, I have low-income people for one reason and one reason alone. There is a decent stock of state housing, which gives people on low incomes the ability to live in that area close to where they work. And Dr Smith, you're intending to take that away. You're intending to sell off those places and to congregate the people in the south and the west, which is the only place where you will have people in state housing. And well may you walk away from that question, because that is the truth of what this minister is trying to do. We can be proud in this country that since the 1930s, people of all incomes that are in urgent need of housing have a place to go. That is what state housing was about. That is what Housing New Zealand is about. And once again, we are seeing a government that simply wants to undermine a fundamental social institution in this country. An institution that I call fundamental because, as Norman Kirk said, one of the critical things that people need in life is an affordable home. Housing New Zealand can guarantee that, but we have seen the erosion of how Housing New Zealand can provide that housing. You know, with housing problems go social problems, and once upon a time in my electorate, the people who worked for Housing New Zealand would take a responsibility to help out with some of the social problems of the tenants there. Dr Smith's goal is to have Housing New Zealand nothing other than a glorified private sector provider that takes no responsibility for those social problems. Once upon a time we had people that were equipped and able to go around the state houses and make sure things were okay. They've stripped that back. Now what they are doing is stripping back the number of state houses, and they are stripping back that fundamental principle that has existed for the best part of 80 years, is that when you go into a state house, provided you pay your rent, provided you look after that home, you have security of tenure. That house is not just bricks and mortar or timber and corrugated iron, it's your home. It's the place that is secure for you. It's the place where you can maintain tenure so your kids don't have to change school every year. It's the place where you can afford a home that's of a decent quality. And what this national government is doing, albeit in a slightly more cunning way than the Richardson national government, is that it is stripping the most poor and the most vulnerable of the right to have that sort of housing assistance. The Labor Party will oppose this bill, and it will oppose it with the support of every person in the housing sector that's looked at the needs of those who are vulnerable and who believes that the steps that this bill take are steps in the wrong direction. We need more houses, not fewer houses. There is a housing crisis of 80,000 houses short, according to the New Zealand Institute. And that means that more people are competing for fewer houses, which means higher rents. You have things like the LVR, which stops people getting into their homes. This is bad legislation.
Marianne Street.
Chairman, I rise to oppose this bill with every fibre of my being. This is an absolute abrogation